my very presumptuous advice to entrepreneurs and to everyone is like, go into the world selflessly. Try to make the world a better place however you can, and let that be your guiding principle, and everything good will follow on from that.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast,
a show where we, Paul Shapiro and Tony Okamoto,
spotlight companies making money by helping solve some of the world's most pressing problems.
Welcome to our 10th episode, dear listeners. We've gotten great feedback from you about the show, and we're delighted every time we hear the podcast has been inspirational for someone. And we're, of course, grateful to our guests for being the most important way this show does good in the world.
And we're especially grateful to our latest guest, Moby. When you think about somebody using their business for good, you don't usually think of a rock star. And when you think of a rock star, you might think hedonistic living and self-aggrandizement. Well, despite the fact that Moby has sold more than 20 million records worldwide and is so famous, in fact, that he only goes by one name, his life is driven toward one primary purpose: to alleviate suffering on the planet.
He's tried to do this not only by using his albums to promote compassion for animals, but also by opening an all-vegan restaurant in LA called Little Pine. And in this episode, we talk with him about all of that and a lot more. So sit back and enjoy hearing about Moby's philosophy on life, his trials and tribulations, and his efforts to use the power of his various businesses to make the world a better place.
All right, Moby, welcome to the show.
Hey, Moby.
Hi.
So when people think of an entrepreneur, often they don't really think of a rock star, but that's exactly what you are. And we want to dig into that, but also how you've used your influence to create some massive good in the world.
Was creating a platform to promote compassion always important to you?
Sort of. I mean, I was raised by idealistic hippies and academics, and it was sort of instilled in me at an early age that, to whatever small extent you can, when you go out into the world and you do things, you should arguably sort of like try to fight against a status quo that might not always be in the best interests of the planet and the inhabitants of the planet. And also just to go out and try and, like, as sort of bland as it sounds, just to try and make things better. But I have to say, I had a long period where I sort of forgot about that. I guess starting in the 90s into about the mid 2000s, I became very, very worldly, very selfish, very materialistic. I sort of thought that a combination of fame, success, wealth, accolades, and stuff, I thought all these things were finally going to deliver happiness. And so I pursued them blindly. And then I guess, around in the mid 2000s, I started really realizing that pursuing all those things and acquiring those things, sort of paradoxically, were not making me happy. If anything, I was less happy. I was miserable. And so it became easy to reject materialism, fame, all those things, having been confronted with the evidence that they didn't deliver happiness.
How long was that period of time for you where you were living in that worldly lifestyle?
I guess about, let's say, 10, 12 years. I had a good, like 9-year run of full on over the top lunatic level worldliness, of thinking that dating movie stars and trying to be on every red carpet and having homes in different places. I thought that was gonna be the key, because I was living in New York, and I love New York City, but there is a value there that people do sort of buy into. They believe that if they have the right combination of stuff, they'll somehow be able to cheat the human condition. And I tried and failed.
So I got a great sense of that reading your book, Porcelain, which I just read, although I think it came out a year or two ago. And it was a really great book. It was, I thought it would be an interesting read, but it was really poignant. And, you read a lot of like memoirs of famous people, and oftentimes they're very self-aggrandizing and they're talking about all the really great things they've done. Whereas I felt like more like you were going out of your way to talk about your own insecurities, your own failures, the most embarrassing moments, which really humanize you. I mean, you think about somebody who goes by one name and is famous, and you think like this person's going to really be talking about how awesome they are. And in reality, the book really shows you as more human than somebody might have imagined. And I'm wondering, was that your intent with the book when you set out to start writing it?
I guess the intent was twofold. First and foremost, the intent was to hopefully entertain people and not waste their time. Because I have read a bunch of memoirs and biographies that just feel way too self-involved. I mean, by definition, a memoir is self-involved, but you have to be aware of the fact that there's an audience, and if they're going to take the time to read what you've written, like you don't want to waste their time. So that was criteria number one. Criteria number two was just to be as honest as I knew how to be. Because I think, and maybe I'm stating the obvious, we live in this culture of just rampant disingenuousness, or whatever the word, disingenuity. And I don't think it's doing anyone any favors. It creates unrealistic, artificial standards that everyone then holds themselves to, even though they never existed in the first place. Like beauty being a perfect example. You have a model who goes to do a photo shoot, and after 5 hours of hair and makeup, he is put in front of perfect lights with a world-class photographer. They then take the image, put it in Photoshop, and spend weeks retouching it and put it out into the world so that people can beat themselves up that they don't look like that. But the truth is, the model themselves doesn't even look like that. So, and just people going out and pretending that they're tougher than they are, and they're cooler than they are, and they're more disaffected than they are. And I think that it's just not making the world a better place. Whereas aspiring to be honest seems like it has the potential to improve things.
Yeah, there's a great video. I think was it Steve Cutts who did the video? I think I actually saw that you shared it. It was the disparity between how people portray themselves on social media versus how they are in their actual lives, like the disparity in happiness and unhappiness between it. It was a very powerful video.
Yeah, and no one benefits from that. I mean, I guess the only people who benefit from it are the people who profit from people making an effort to sort of self-aggrandize themselves, or the people who are so depressed at not being able to successfully self-aggrandize themselves. So I'm sure that, the people who make fentanyl are thrilled at the sort of discord in the human condition. If there are a bunch of healthy people, no one would need opiates.
So the book as a business, I mean, you are descended from Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. My guess is that Porcelain didn't sell as well as Moby Dick, but it's maybe too high a standard to hold yourself. How did the book do?
I think it did fine. I mean, weirdly, sadly, Moby Dick did terribly when it first came out. Like Herman Melville had some success as a writer of sea adventures, and then Moby Dick came out and it kind of destroyed his career very, very sadly. Luckily, that did not happen with me. I think I found a middle ground where I don't think I've written a great American classic, but at least it didn't destroy my life.
So you mentioned that your parents had a big hand in creating your goodness. And I also know that you were very devout Christian as a teenager. Do you think that also helped shape you into caring more about giving back and being a good steward to the earth and animals?
Possibly. I think it's a combination of things. Because I was also a crazy punk rocker for a while, and I was a philosophy major and studied comparative religions. So I almost think that as much as I love the teachings of Christ and the character of Christ, I think in a way it's almost, and this might sound heretical or bad, but it's almost more of a symptom of a deeper interest in, and it's so when I say it out loud, it seems really self-evident, which is you look at the world and you say that things aren't working as well as they could. And then the question becomes, well, why do you have 7.5 billion people working to maintain a status quo that isn't working? And that leads to punk rock, it leads to philosophy, it leads to everything. It's like this question of like, what is broken in the human condition that we all bend over backwards to maintain a world order that obviously, by all empirical data and measure, is not working.
Yeah, I know that I grew up in a very conservative household with Catholic parents, and I was raised to think that there was something wrong with gay people, and that if you were different and you looked different, then you were wrong. And then I found punk rock and just changed my life dramatically, opened me up to so many different types of people, and I became just a better person overall. And I actually wrote a piece. I went to a Catholic college, and I wrote a piece about how punk rock really changed my life and was the center of spirituality for me and opened me up to so many more ideas that I had never even considered because I thought that they were wrong. Do you still identify as a Christian today?
No, I don't know what I identify as. I think I identify as someone who's 53 years old in a universe that's 15 billion years old. And as a result, I identify as nothing, maybe, if someone held a gun to my head, I guess I would identify as, a Taoist who likes quantum mechanics and Sufi poetry and thinks the teachings of Christ are great. And I also really like Led Zeppelin. Like that would be my statement of belief.
Nice. So you may think of yourself as nothing, and obviously from the cosmic perspective, that's true. But, you've sold over 20 million albums. People, when they think of you, they definitely don't think of you as nothing. They probably don't think of you as a Christian, but they probably do think of you as a musician. And if they know anything other than that, they know that you're an animal advocate, since you're so vociferous on that point. And they might know you run a vegan business, Little Pine, which we're going to talk about also, which Tony and I have both eaten at and love and highly recommend. But can you just tell us a little bit about how it came to be? So you write this very poignant passage in the book about when you decided that protecting animals and advocating them was going to be your life's mission. What was that time?
Well, like most people, I grew up with the paradox, and that's like capital P paradox, which is the paradox of loving animals and also eating animals. There are a lot of other, I don't know the plural of paradoxes, paradoxes. There are a lot of other paradoxes in the way in which we live, but like that one really is so glaring that I almost think of it as like the central human paradox. And it would be so, we see it so clearly when it's applied to humans. Like if you love humans, but you also imprison them and torture them and rape them and kill them and eat them, obviously you're Jeffrey Dahmer, and we know that there's something wrong with you. So we see that paradox when it's applied to people. But I grew up with that paradox of I lived in a house filled with rescue animals, and I loved them more than any of the people I knew, but I also loved going to Burger King, and I loved pepperoni pizza and salami sandwiches. And then when I was 19, I had my Saul on the road to Damascus moment where I was petting a cat, Tucker, who I'd found barely alive at the dump. And Tucker went on to be this happy, long-lived, healthy cat. And I was petting Tucker, and all of a sudden, the paradox in my brain disappeared. And I suddenly realized, Tucker had his 2 eyes, central nervous system, and this really rich emotional life. And in an instant, I suddenly realized every creature with 2 eyes and a central nervous system, or maybe it was even with octopuses, more than 2 eyes. If they have more than 2 eyes, I'm ignorant as far as the taxonomy.
I think they have 2 eyes but 8 legs.
Okay. So I suddenly realized like every living, breathing creature has a rich emotional life and just wants to be left alone to live its own life. And so in that instant, I I became a vegetarian. That was 1984. And then 3 years later, after reading Diet for New America, I became a vegan. So this, Thanksgiving 2018 will be my 31-year vegan anniversary.
Congratulations. That's cool. So I became vegan in 1993. And so I guess it's like 25 years ago. And I think about when I think about what it was like to be vegan in the early to mid 90s, I can only imagine what it was like back in the 80s and the type of things that you were eating. Although actually I know what you were eating since I just read your book and it didn't sound that appetizing. Do you want to share some of the things that you were eating back then?
Yeah, it was a lot of oats and a lot of brown rice and tofu, beans. I mean, it's actually like weirdly healthy now that I think about it. Because I was, when I first became a vegan, I was making $2,000 a year. And then I was living in an abandoned factory. So, at most, I was spending $10 a week on food. And oddly enough, eating quite well. Oatmeal with walnuts and raisins is dirt cheap and profoundly healthy.
So, Moby, I want to ask you about that factory. You spent a good bit of time talking about what your life was like, basically living as like a homeless DJ in this factory where you had essentially like cardboard walls for this little 100 square foot area that
plywood, to be fair.
Excuse me. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for the correction. So that must have been much better for insulation. And you talked about how happy you were and you really loved your life then. And I'm wondering, fast forward to today, are you happier today than you were when you were living in that factory?
I don't know if happier. I mean, it really does sort of beg the question. Like we can measure happiness, in terms of like looking at neurotransmitters and looking at our endocrine system. And, there's basic, like almost like biometric data to determine whether an organism is happy. But the more intangible side is like, what is happiness and what is it the product of? And so in a weird way, and also the idea that there's sort of like a quantitative hierarchical scale of happiness. Like I'm happy today in ways that I simply couldn't have been in 1988 when I was living in an abandoned factory. And the reverse is true as well. Like I was happy then in just this kind of wonderfully naive, young, clueless way. And now I'm happy in a way that like I've seen the world and I don't know, I have a perspective that I think is by definition the product of all the experiences I've had. And I'm really grateful for that perspective. In fact, I'm probably more grateful for that than anything else in my life.
I follow you on Instagram, and it's been really interesting for me to watch your journey as you let go of a lot of the things that maybe you felt pressured to have. You had a pool, and now you have a beautiful wild backyard, and you've gotten rid of a lot of your stuff. Can you talk a little bit about why you're going toward the more minimalist route and bringing nature more into your life?
I guess that it simply makes more sense to me. I had this sort of, again, self-evident realization about 10 years ago. I was sitting outside at my house in Los Angeles, and I was reading some crappy magazine, and there was an advertisement for a very expensive watch, like a $10,000 watch. And I looked at this watch, and then in front of me, there was a pine tree I just planted. And the pine tree, like you can buy a sapling. Granted, I was selfish and I bought a more adult pine tree, but like a pine tree costs, $10. And I thought, so here you have a pine tree that can grow for 100 years, that can turn carbon dioxide into oxygen, that cools the air and provides a home for countless creatures. And it is $10. And here you have a stupid watch that's $10,000 that tells time slightly worse than a $5 Casio. And I just thought, like, what in the world? Like, why would anyone value something that doesn't have intrinsic value. Like why do we put a price tag on things that are pointless, that are a waste of time? And I don't so I think it was just it seemed so clear to me. Why value things just because other people value them, or our culture has determined that things are valuable. I guess this is sort of where punk rock comes in, is question everything for yourself, and don't embrace anyone else's criteria or opinions just because they're widely held.
It's so funny you talk about the watch, because as somebody who follows politics, I was keenly following the former governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, who got busted on all types of bribery and corruption charges. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was this lobbyist had given him, I think it was even like a $25,000 watch or something like that. And I just remember thinking, what a stupid way to be so weak that you could be bribed by something like that, and how you could inoculate yourself against those charges if you just didn't care about it. Like if you could persuade yourself that it just didn't matter, you could inoculate yourself. It would be such a better way to live.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is too esoteric, but it all really does, I think, I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying as well, but a lot of it is neural architecture. And, we as a species, we love things that hit the older parts of our brain, like fatty foods and porn and, fancy watches, it hits an older part of our brain that's very materialistic. But I guess if you ideally over time start living more in your prefrontal cortex, the executive part of the executive functioning part of the brain, you become more rational. At least I hope so. You could almost say that our species, for our species to survive, we have to evolve away from these older, more impulse-driven parts of the brain to the part of the brain that is capable of executive long-term function.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that I would be extremely stressed if I had $10,000 on my wrist. I would be thinking just about all the potential danger that could befall me were I walking around with that.
I would just be annoyed. I'd be like, why do I have this stupid heavy thing hanging on my wrist that tells time worse than my phone? One, I'm now a magnet for crime. And two, what else could I have done with this $10,000? Now it's just it's a hunk of stupid metal. It's not going to feed anyone. It's not going to turn CO2 into oxygen. It doesn't help people who need it. There's no benefit created at all. If anything, you could say the creation of that stupid watch is so toxic. What it requires to get the natural materials and turn them into that watch, it's everything about it is terrible.
True. So I want to get into some of the ways that you've used your platform, your business to promote good in the world, especially for animals, which, as you talk about in the book, are really your prime motivating drive in life. And actually, this goes to the first time I had ever heard of you. So back in '96, I was this vegan, straight edge, hardcore kid who would never have listened to rave music ever. But when your album Animal Rights came out, that obviously came onto my radar for obvious reasons. And it wasn't so much rave music as much as it was punk. And so even though it may not have been a great commercial success, it definitely had greater success with me, which it led me to get introduced to you. And as I sat there reading this CD that I had from you, I was reading the notes in there and all these, I think it was essays on animal rights in there. And to me, that seems like the first time you really used your platform to try to promote some type of good for others in the world. Is that right? And if you could tell us a little bit about your decision to name the album that and to start using your fame as a platform, your fame and your business as a musician as a platform for animals.
Actually, I mean, the album before that was called Everything Is Wrong, and that also had animal rights essays in it.
Okay. Didn't make it to me, but I'm glad I'm got to go look at that now, though.
And luckily, I learned something the other day that really I was very humbled by. Is Sean Monson told me that the animal rights essays and Everything Is Wrong is why he became vegan.
And for those who don't know, this is the director of a film called Earthlings about animal rights issues.
Yeah, and I was like, wow, I'm so humbled and honored to have played a weird accidental part in that. So again, I'm going to go back and give some credit to my family and say like that ethos that was instilled in me in an early age of like, if you're going to do something in the world, try and do something good. Like there's no guarantee that any of us, even if we're profoundly well-intentioned, are doing good, but we sort of naively, humbly have to try. And especially as time has passed, and like I said, I had that, decade or more long period of truly selfish materialism, and it made me miserable and almost killed me. And I look around the world at me like, just look at our president. Our president is the poster child for selfish materialism, and he is a broken, sad, destroyed human being. Like when you're the president of the United States and your name exists in gold letters 15 feet tall in buildings around the world, and you are miserable and angry and racist, like clearly that means selfishness and materialism doesn't work.
You've had a broad reach working with everyone from Guns N' Roses to Michael Jackson to Public Enemy to Britney Spears. Did you get a sense that any of these other stars you've worked with were motivated by some altruistic cause driving their life in the way animal rights does for you?
A little bit. I think that, it's really hard to live in a world that unrelentingly glorifies selfishness and materialism. Like it's really hard to be in that environment and not buy into it. Having said that, I do see some people who are really trying to move away from that. Like I had a conversation with Jim Carrey recently, and we were both sort of, even though, he's a way more, successful than I've ever been, but he sort of has come to some of these same conclusions that like, when he was just nothing but selfish and materialistic, he was truly despondent. And the more he pursues a spiritual life and the more philanthropic he becomes, simply the happier he becomes. And the more, in a way, it's almost like, I don't know, like it's like getting well. Like you slowly emerge from this illness of, bitter selfishness and bitter materialism, and you just start to inhabit yourself in a different way, and you feel this like a clarity of purpose. It's really nice having like, and who knows, I hope I don't sound arrogant in saying that, but for me, it seems to work quite a lot better.
Yeah, I think so. And I got that sense from reading your book too. When you were talking in the book about your desire to do more, let's say like death metal or punk type music, but that your fans were more into rave and like electronic dance music and so on. And how your friend Barry made the point to you. You said that if he had told you would make more money by doing rave music, that you would have laughed him off. But when he told you that you were making more people happy by doing it, then that was the way to persuade you.
Yeah, it makes me think of, there's this story a friend of mine told me. There's a monastery at Mount Baldy in Southern California. It's up way at the top of a mountain. Its claim to fame is Leonard Cohen used to live there. And the head of the monastery is this old Tibetan man or Chinese man who rarely leaves the monastery. And one day, this friend of mine was driving him down the hill into the dystopia of like Orange County, Riverside, like that whole, like that sprawl of just like suburban mess. And he said that the head of the monastery just started crying. And the guy looked at him, he's like, "What's wrong?" And the head of the monastery just simply like looked out at all this sprawl of suburbia, and he just simply said, "So much suffering." And it's true. Like people suffer, and part of the suffering we can't avoid. Like, we get sick, we die, people we care about die, or people we care about, leave us. But so much suffering is self-inflicted. And I feel like if we can try to help people to, one, maybe suffer less, but also to like needlessly suffer less, to bring people comfort and bring people a little more awareness that will hopefully like lead them to just stop making terrible choices that just contribute to their suffering. There's also a potential knock-on effect is that people then are less likely to contribute to the suffering of others, and that includes animals.
Yes, and speaking of animals, you have a vegan restaurant. What inspired you to start that restaurant?
Just activism, 100%. I mean, because any money that comes into the restaurant or any proceeds that come into the restaurant, we give to animal rights organizations. So entrepreneurially, I can never personally make a penny from the restaurant. Because opening a restaurant is hard. I mean, it's really everything, like finding the building, renovating the building, going through the permitting process, hiring people, making sure the food is good, making sure the climate is okay, like every last thing has to be perfect for every single second that you're open. So it's really challenging. But what I found is, especially in the world of animal rights activism, books are profoundly important. Documentaries are profoundly important. Social media posts are profoundly important. TED Talks, Cubes of Truth, these are all really important. But a vegan restaurant, a good vegan restaurant, reaches people in a way that is so different from any of those things. And I think of it as like bricks and mortar activism. So when I have a vegan restaurant that serves nice food and has a great wine list, people can come in, non-vegans can come in, and they're exposed to veganism in a way that otherwise they might not be. So that's quite literally the only reason that I opened the restaurant and continue to run it. And if it wasn't effective as an outlet for activism, I would shut it down tomorrow.
Oh, that's really cool. I know that I love Little Pine. I went there recently, and I also did a video of Little Pine with my business partner, Michelle. It's got a great vibe and style, and I feel like I could bring people who are not vegetarian and they would have a perfectly enjoyable experience. And it also introduces them to the deliciousness of vegan food. So thank you for doing that. I read on Instagram recently that people were giving you a hard time about being a for-profit. Can you talk a little bit about how that made you feel? You do so much good for the world, and this is obviously an act of activism. So to be criticized for your good work, how does that make you feel?
Well, to be fair, I'm sure that there are people who have criticized me for that, but that I was specifically responding to a person, and I don't know who this person is, but someone wrote really scathing things saying like, I thought this was a nonprofit. And I was like, no, it's a for-profit business and we give our profits to nonprofits. I was like, it couldn't be more clear. And I just had to and I felt a little bit dickish having to do this, but I had to then say since Little Pine has opened, I've combined its revenues with my own charitable giving, and we've given over $1 million to animal rights organizations. And I said, if you want the proof of that is here are the animal rights organizations, go talk to them. It's out in the open. It's as clear as possible. And, I normally like to, if people are criticizing me, I try not to respond. I just sort of rise above the fray. But this really, it cut because it's I was like, if you only knew how difficult it was to open and run a restaurant. And I know in the core of my being that I can never personally profit from it. So it was weird being accused of something that was 180 degrees opposite from where I know myself to be.
I certainly can imagine how painful that must be and why you felt the need to respond. Let me ask you, Moby. So a lot of people, certainly myself included, have wondered and wrestled with this issue over whether it is better to use your money, let's say, to donate to a charity or to invest in a business that might be able to solve a problem. The quintessential example being that the animal welfare movement really got founded in America on the treatment about the mistreatment of horses in America's streets, and there were all these campaigns to improve the treatment of horses, and then Henry Ford comes along and renders the horse-drawn carriage totally obsolete, achieving for horses more than the animal advocates even ever dreamt of achieving. And there's lots of other examples of this, in the same way that it wasn't humane sentiment that liberated whales from harpoons, but rather it was kerosene. And so my question for you is, you said you've given over $1 million to charity. I'm sure that does a lot of good in the world. My question for you is, Are you also invested in companies that might do good in the world that could be like the Fords to render certain bad practices toward animals obsolete? And do you think there might be a case that investing in such companies, or maybe even starting such companies like Little Pine, could possibly do even more good for the cause that you're fighting for animals, than charitable giving?
Yeah, I'm part of this group called the Farm Animal Funders. And it's basically a group of people who are really committed to giving as much money as possible to farm animal rights organizations. I can't bring myself to use the word welfare. I mean, I know it's a perfectly fine word. I'm just like still the old, DXE punk rocker in me. I'm like, so it's a shortcoming on my part that I can't use the word welfare. So we had a meeting in New York last week, and it's really remarkable people. I'm sure you know every single person who's part of this group. And I brought this up. I said, there, broadly speaking, are three ways of advancing what we're doing. One is giving to existing 501c3s, supporting for-profit corporate, companies. And then the third is getting involved in the world of politics. And so my feeling is we do everything, it's because all of them can be effective, so I'd say honestly, very broadly speaking, personally, I do thirds, so a third of my money goes to 501c3s, goes to charities. A third goes to for-profit, and that can be everything from Hampton Creek to trying to fund documentaries, et cetera, things that exist in the commercial world. And then a third is political giving, because when the new Congress is in session, I want to go there and get all my congressmen, who I've given money to and all the orgs I work with, and say, okay, what are you going to do for animal rights? What are you going to do for the farm bill? What are you going to do? And it's really hard to do that if you haven't given them money. If I walk in and say, oh, Moby, maybe you bought my record 20 years ago. What are you going to do for farm animals? They'll be like, oh, that's cute. Here's a pin, but if you can say wow, I gave $250,000 to Democrats in the last electoral cycle, what are you going to do for farm animals? They respond a lot differently.
Sure. We definitely live in a pay-to-play world, especially in politics. So you wrote Porcelain, and this wasn't your first book. You also co-authored Gristle with Mian Park, a book about factory farming of animals prior. Do you have other literary plans for your future?
Well, I'm putting out a second memoir next May, and it's a sort of two-part narrative. It's childhood and then the 8 years after the release of the album Play, sort of interwoven, and boy, is it dark. It's it makes this first, because the memoir Porcelain is pretty dark. The second one it's so dark that my publisher has actually come to me saying, are you sure you want to release this? This is very, very dark. And I'm like, yeah, might as well. So it's everything, suicide attempts, all sorts of, it's things going wrong in every way that things can go wrong.
Wow. Well, I'll definitely look forward to reading it, and will brace myself before I open it up. Moby, I know you're a big sci-fi fan also, as am I. I read sci-fi quite often and would love to compare notes with you, but would you ever write a sci-fi book?
Well, so after I wrote the memoir Porcelain, I had a moment of literary arrogance. And I thought to myself, I'm a writer now. I can go write books. And I tried writing fiction, and I realized I can't. I don't know how people do it. Because writing a memoir, it has to be quasi-literary. It has to be well written. There has to be decent sentence structure. But you're basically, when you're writing a memoir, you're transcribing the past. You don't have to invent anything. Whereas fiction is invention. And I'm just amazed I'm amazed and grateful that people know how to do it, because my limited attempts at writing fiction, I just don't know how to do it.
That's so funny you say that because while you and I have not traveled very similar paths in many regards, we certainly have in this, and that before I wrote the book Queen Meat, I actually wrote a novel. It's kind of like a sci-fi look at the human relationship with other animals on the planet. And I really thought this was going to be like a success. And there wasn't a single publisher who would pay me much for it. And that ended up leading me to write the book Queen Meat instead, which thankfully did well. But I still hope to publish this book someday. Maybe it is literary arrogance on my part, but I hope to publish it someday. And even if it would have a small audience, so maybe it would have a big audience. We'll see.
Moby, are there any books that you might recommend to someone who is an aspiring entrepreneur?
Books for someone who's an aspiring entrepreneur. Yes. Anything that involves the quotes of John Muir. That I think every human being should just doesn't have to, I mean, he wrote a lot. He was a Scottish naturalist who really was just like this, like the champion of forests and state parks and whatever. But I don't know, oddly enough, I would think John Muir and some of the Sufi poets, and maybe the Tao Te Ching, just to put things in perspective. Because there's this one story in the new memoir, and my publisher asked me not to tell any stories from the new memoir, but I'm going to tell one. So I was at a birthday party. It's right before I got sober. 'Cause that's another thing that happened. In 2008, I stopped drinking. And that certainly changed my worldview quite a lot. But I was at this birthday party, and it was a birthday party for one of Donald Trump's best friends. This guy, I forget his first name. His last name's Lafrac. And all the New York billionaires were there, like Bloomberg and Steve Schwartzman, and Trump was there. And they had it in the Hammerstein Ballroom. If you've ever been to it, it holds 3,000 or 4,000 people. And there were 100 people there for this very expensive, fancy birthday party. And Earth, Wind, and Fire were performing. And so Earth, Wind, and Fire got up to perform, and these sclerotic old billionaires started dancing with their wives or mistresses, while Trump sat in the corner, probably tweeting. And they were so joyless. And I looked over, and sort of in the corner, there was a door to the kitchen. And the kitchen staff were dancing and smiling and having a way better time than the billionaires. And I thought to myself, what's the point of being a billionaire and being a selfish lunatic materialist if you're miserable and you're not making the world a better place? So I think that's my advice for entrepreneurs is get rid of the assumption that wealth and fame are going to make anything better. I mean, granted, it's nice to be able to pay the rent. It's nice to be able to take your friends out to dinner. But beyond that, I mean, it just doesn't, that assumption that wealth and fame really are going to make people happy and give you this great quality of life. There is not evidence for that. I've known a lot of these super crazy, successful, wealthy billionaires, et cetera. And they're happiest when they're playing with a puppy or contributing to a cause that they care about. So I think my very presumptuous advice to entrepreneurs and to everyone is go into the world selflessly. Try to make the world a better place however you can, and let that be your guiding principle, and everything good will follow on from that.
Yeah, I hear you. Very poignant words to bring us out. We only have about a minute left, Moby, but I'll tell you, the only thing that I think that wealth can really be great in terms of providing happiness for that person who's wealthy is the ability to use it in the service of others, to help others, whether investing in companies that can make the world a better place, giving it to charities that'll do so, or like you said, even taking your friends out. But it does seem like we make ourselves much happier when we use our resources, including our wealth, for the benefit of others rather than for the benefit of ourselves.
It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once you've satisfied, once you have a clean bed to sleep in, and once you're warm in the wintertime and have enough food in your stomach, the next question should be, how can I help?
So on that note, the final question we ask every guest on the show is, what are some of the things, or maybe one thing for which you are grateful? So do you want to end us, Moby, by just telling us what you're grateful for?
I'm grateful for everything. I mean, I wouldn't even know, like, I'm grateful for the fact that I'm in New York and it's 40 degrees outside, but currently I'm warm. I'm grateful that, even though the world is an inch away from catastrophe and apocalypse, there are still like seemingly smart, good people working to make the world a better place. One thing I was just having, because a lot of the other stuff and things I'm grateful for are really self-evident. But one thing, and maybe this will resonate with you, or maybe it's going to sound batshit crazy, I have no idea, is one of the things I'm really grateful for is death. I was having this conversation with a friend the other night because people around us had been dying. And I was like, death is the greatest mercy. Imagine a world without death. Like I went to an animal save, an LA animal save, and I was looking at the pigs and I was like, wow, death is the only mercy they'll ever experience. It's the only grace that they'll ever encounter is when their lives end. So I'm weirdly grateful for death because for the majority of creatures, it's the only respite to suffering they'll ever experience.
Yeah, I often think that death is the best day of many farm animals' lives, for sure. It's the day that it ends. However, I will say it's not a surprise to me that so many of the religions on Earth, like Hinduism and Buddhism, the whole goal is to avoid being reborn. Like they want you to live your life in such a way. They all have different prescriptions of how you do it, but their goal is that when you die is not to come back, which doesn't seem that surprise.
Yeah, I know that you're supposed to like break the wheel of samsara. That actually makes me angry. Because what about the people who remain? What about the creatures who remain? Like you cannot in good conscience leave the wheel of existence while people are still suffering and animals are still suffering here.
Yeah, I think that's why in Buddhism, at least, like bodhisattvas are so revered, is because they have broken free and yet they still return. That's the whole purpose. They return for the benefit of others, right?
I mean, it must be, I don't want to anthropomorphize the universe, but like if that is the case, like knowingly going back to a life and a world of suffering, I mean, I don't know if I could do that, but to me that seems like that would be ideally the most noble calling.
Well, we're grateful to you, Moby, for having a noble calling and using both your wealth and your fame to help make the world a better place.
And we're grateful that you came on the show to share your story. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
All right, folks, thanks so much for listening to the show.
We hope you got a lot out of it and that you will show us some love. You can rate Business for Good as 5 stars on iTunes, support us on Patreon, and tell your friends interested in business or really just in making the world a better place about the show.
And we'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please feel free to contact us anytime via our website, businessforgoodpodcast.com.
And as always, we hope that you will be in the business of doing good.